Should we start?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Piyali Chatterjee to give this IIA Astrophysics seminar, which is also a part of the ongoing 18th annual Pencil Code meeting, which we are hosting at IIA. So Piyali did her PhD in 2007 from the Department of Physics of the Indian Institute of Science. Her thesis was titled as Flux Transport Solar Dynamo Model and Solar Cycle Prediction. And subsequent to that, so she held postdoctoral positions first at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai, and then at Nordita, and then at the High Altitude Observatory in Boulder, and then at the University of Oslo. And after that, she joined IIA as a reader in 2015, where she has been since with us. So she was actually introduced to the Pencil Code in 2009 as a postdoc with Axel Brandenburg. And today, so she will be speaking on her recent work on the connection between solar spicules and polymeric fluid jets using the Pencil Code. So before I hand it over to her, I just want to make a small announcement that you may have some pressing questions during the talk. So instead of just grabbing the microphone and speaking on it, so please raise your hand first, and then I will permit you to speak to that. So Piyali, so the stage is all yours now. So please.
Yeah, thanks, Sharanya, for introducing me, and I'm very happy to present our recent work. The first author of which is my PhD student Shohel Dev, and the experiments all were performed at the Azim Premji University, also in Bangalore, and the group in UK, which comprises of Mariana, Jaja, Chris, and Robert. So they helped us with data analysis routines and observational data analysis. So, and I hope you can all see my screen and hear me clearly, because we are actually in the conference room attending the Pencil Code meeting. So, yeah. So basically, we all know here in IIA that solar spicules are these jets of plasma which are shot up. And they come back down under gravity, and often the images they look like a burning grassland. But actually, if you look at a time-lapse video, there are jets which are going up and down. And the lifetime of these jets are about 9 to 10 minutes, and they can go as high as 15 to 20 megameters. But on an average, the height will be lower, maybe around 7 megameters above the solar surface, the visible solar surface. Now let me show you another really visually striking, at least for me, video where we basically bounce a petri dish full of paint on a speaker at a frequency of 30 hertz. And there also you see initially a wall of fluid forming and then breaking into jets. And in some cases, you also see the twist. So one of the very common things that you immediately see is both are a fluid medium, or at least can be approximated as fluid medium. So the solar plasma, we use the MHD approximation, the magnetohydrodynamic approximation, which is basically like a hydromagnetic fluid. And in both cases, you have gravity. So these jets are forming, and they are shot up, and they are ballistic, so they come back down under gravity. So the tips of these jets, they follow parabolic paths. So now if we would like to do some scaling, give some scaling arguments about what is the similitude between this observed solar spicules and these paint jets that I showed you. So on the sun, the solar convection is powering this plasma jets. So the typical frequency of vibration that you would see on the solar surface is basically this 5-minute mode that is very well known of the granulation, and that amounts to about 3.3 millihertz. Whereas in the paint, we apply forcing, which is a parametric forcing. It has two parameters. One is the acceleration A, amplitude of the acceleration A, and the driving frequency F naught. So this F naught here again is in the laboratory we take to be 30 hertz, which is what is known as the subwoofer frequency or base frequencies. So using these values, we obtain typical width, height, and velocity scales that is observed on the sun and correspondingly in the laboratory in the paint jets. And you can see these values in megameters, 10 raised to 6 meters, whereas the fluid ones have dimensions in centimeters. And this is the typical velocity at which the jets are shot up on the sun, 30 to 50 kilometers per second. Whereas in the fluid, they're as low as 0.25 meters per second. And the aspect ratio of these jets that we find are also close. And from that, we also calculate what is known as a Froude number. So the Froude number tells you the importance of the gravity in the dynamics of the fluid in the system. And when we calculate the Froude number, there are two different expressions. So for the plasma, of course, we don't have a free surface. There is no air fluid interface. It's a continuous medium. So the Froude number expressions are different in both cases. But once you calculate the Froude number, they are also not very far from each other. I would think they are very close. And the column here where we measure the relative acceleration scaled by the local gravity. So on the sun, it is the surface gravity of the sun, whereas on Earth, it's 10 meter per second square, which is the Earth's gravity. So the scaling of the acceleration of the jet scaled by the local gravity is also in a very close range. And the last column here, we compare what is known as the driving frequency versus the life multiplied by the lifetime, which is also a non-dimensional number. So that driving frequency is 3.3 millihertz for the sun and 30 hertz in the lab for the paint jets. And then we multiply it by the lifetime of the observed jets in both cases in the lab and on the sun. And those numbers are also in a very nice close range. So we are of course encouraged by this observation here. And then let me try to explain a little bit about this forcing that I mentioned earlier. This A cos 2 pi F naught T. So this is basically a harmonic excitation that is provided to a Petri dish full of fluid when placed on a speaker. So it's mounted on there's a Petri dish mounted on a speaker, and then we excite it using such a forcing. So this is a well-known problem of what is known as Faraday excitation. Faraday of the same Michael Faraday. So what I show here is a series of experiments performed using a Newtonian fluid. A Newtonian fluid is a idealistic fluid in which your viscosity is constant, which means your stresses are directly proportional to the strain rate in case of the fluid. So what happens when you increase the amplitude A as well as the driving frequency gradually? I mean, either the amplitude or the driving frequency or both. What happens is initially you see a spherically symmetric pattern because the Petri dish is circular symmetry. So you see this circularly symmetric pattern, and which is basically oscillating with certain frequency, which is half of the driving frequency. But as you make the amplitude higher and higher, alternatively, you can increase your driving frequency. You see that this circular symmetry breaks and you get these patterns, these star and hexagonal patterns. So this kind of a behavior can be explained by a well-known mathematical equation known as the damped Matthew equation. So which I also show here. So this is a very simple second order equation in time. where this zeta is basically giving the height of the free surface from a reference point. And then you also have this forcing, which is the ratio of the amplitude of the acceleration scaled by the gravity. And then you also have this cos omega naught t, where omega naught, remember, is the driving frequency. So this particular equation also uses another parameter known as capital omega. This capital omega is basically gives the dispersion relation as a function of the wave number for what are known as surface gravity waves. But here I would call them surface gravity capillary waves, because these fluids are also influenced by surface tension. So they have an air-fluid interface, and hence there's an effect of surface tension. So the dispersion relation is actually very simple. Most of you will recognize this first term, which is gravity multiplied by the wave number, and then you have this last term where gamma is the surface tension. So if your cells become smaller and smaller, the importance of surface tension increases. But if your cells are bigger, then the surface tension does not play a role. You can call them surface gravity waves. But if there are smaller and smaller cells, then you cannot neglect the influence of surface tension. In this Matthew equation, you also have another term, which is known as the viscous attenuation. Of course, fluids have viscosity, so you have viscous attenuation. That's why you call it a damped. So this equation actually describes the Faraday excitation when the amplitudes are very small. So this is almost in a linear regime, but this actually explains a very simple thing, which is known as nonlinear resonant coupling or mode coupling. So what happens is when your amplitude is much smaller, and in this particular range, depending on the viscous attenuation divided by the driving frequency, which is quoted here, you only see this nice circularly symmetric waves, which are known as subharmonic because it is half of the driving frequency. Now, when you increase the amplitude, what happens is you will have more than one mode which is excited, and two modes can add up to produce a third mode. So this is what is the resonant coupling here. And as a result of it, you see multiple cells. Now, we are still in a regime where the amplitude is much less. Now, if I increase the amplitude even more, what happens is you get more and more cells in the first of all. And then not just that, often these walls of these cells will collide, and then you will get these jets. So you can see these patterns forming, and also these jets which are being excited when we increase the amplitude of the excitation. And at this point, the amplitude is so large that the patterns have become independent of the container geometry. So even if the container was not circular, it was square or a triangle, you will still have this if your amplitude and the frequency is in the correct range. Now, the formation of these jets is actually a very interesting phenomena that has been studied. And this is known as collapsing surface singularities. So there's this really nice paper in Nature 2 decades ago, where they basically tried to explain why these jets are essentially forming. So because of this surface gravity waves, you have the surface getting distorted in different ways. And sometimes these surface, they develop this kind of a cusp or a singularity. And when that develops, the surface, basically violent jets can be ejected from that surface. So this is one of the mechanisms in which you can have these jets being produced using fluid which has been excited using this Faraday excitation. So now when you make your amplitude really large, you see an interesting phenomena, something that we also see in nature, and which is basically these water dance of a male alligator. So what these alligators do is they submerge their neck a little bit under the lake's surface, and they sing. So they do so it is kind of a territorial war, so to preserve their territory as well as to attract possible mates. So the alligator which dances best is, the one who wins. So basically they submerge their neck and they try to sing at frequencies which are of the order of 19 to 20 hertz. So when they do that, so there's a thin layer of water which has formed between the surface of the lake and the alligator's back. And then you can see these nice jets. But the problem is there is a lot of splashing here, right? So there are no coherent jets. So these jets try to form, but then you only see droplets afterwards, right? But this is a very nice example of large amplitude Faraday excitation that we can observe in nature. So now what happens is, suppose you add a little bit of a polymer to the fluid. For example, in this case, we have added polyvinyl alcohol to polyvinyl alcohol solution and water, and then we do the same experiment, same Faraday experiment. But here you see the number of droplets that are being formed is much less than that what you saw was happening when it was only water. So often you have these, so our idea is that there are these polymer chains inside these jets, which are basically trying to hold the jet together, give it a very coherent nature, not allowing it to break. Now this instability in which these jets try to break into droplets is known as the Plateau-Rayleigh instability. So this is also very well known and has been studied in there's a paper in 1880, sorry, I forgot the actual date right now. We have all referred to these really old papers. So this is known as the Plateau-Rayleigh instability that has been studied. So this is this droplet formation from these jets. Now it is also very well known that these polymers are polymeric chains suppress droplet formation. So for example, in the top, you have this water jet, which is being shot out from a syringe, for example, from the left to from the left to right. And here you see there is so much of droplet formation, and you know, it looks really turbulent. Whereas in the picture at the bottom, you have, so these people have added a very small amount, 200 parts per million of what is known as a polyethylene oxide polymer to the jet, and that gives a really glassy structure to this same jet. So it's the same speed, same syringe, same thing, only they have added a little bit of the polymer here. So the idea here is these polymers, which are basically like blobs, but they can extend, are like springs. And these springs basically store some of this turbulent energy. So the excess kinetic energy that you give to the jets is actually stored in the springs. And that is what is making the jet less turbulent. So that is basically the idea. So just to explore a little bit more, I would introduce the concept of non-Newtonian fluids. So where the viscosity is a function of stress. So in the Newtonian regime, we have the viscosity is independent of the stress. So for example, this flat line here corresponds to Newtonian fluids, whereas this curve here where the viscosity is decreasing with stress corresponds to shear thinning. So like a lot of fluids that we encounter, for example, shampoo and ketchup, those kind of fluids are shear thinning. So you apply a shear and they flow better. Whereas there are some other kinds of fluids which thicken when you apply shear. For example, that should be the cake batter, for example. That would be shear thickening. So this is the idea of a non-Newtonian fluid where the viscosity depends on the stress. So microscopically, what happens is you have a polymer. When you add the polymer to the solution, it is in the form of a blob, and these blue here are showing basically the springs. And you stretch them, so they still remain blob, but they try to stretch. Each of these blobs contain, say, a few monomers. So polymer is made of monomers. So this polymer is like, imagine a cluster of rubber bands which have been really got entangled, and you are trying to stretch it. So this is how basically the polymer behaves when you are going to stretch it. So in our experiments, we actually obtained this direct optical evidence of polymer stretching when these jets are formed. So, so basically what we did, sorry. Yeah. So basically we place the experiment between a polarizer and analyzer, and we adjust the angle of them. So in a particular angle, what happens is you see a dark field of view, whereas you turn the polarizer and analyzer and keep them at 45 to 135 degrees relative to each other, and then you see a bright, the field of view is brightened. So this is basically because along the jet there are electrons and they are absorbing the electric field which is along the jet, and then that will basically absorb the polarization in that plane, and it will only allow the polarization perpendicular to it. So that basically is a direct optical evidence of the fact that the polymers are stretching. The polymers stretch when these kind of jets are forming. So a little bit more about theory of this linear viscoelasticity. So that's the most simplest model we have. So basically one of the easiest way to understand this is what is known as the Maxwell dashpot model. So basically the viscoelastic fluid, or a fluid in which a little bit of polymer is added, can be thought of as a spring like this with a spring constant G, and attached to it is basically this kind of a pot in which you have a fluid of viscosity mu. So as the fluid, this whole setup is like the polymer which is interacting with the fluid, and then basically people solve these equations, and then what happens is you get a concept of a relaxation time. So when you stretch the polymer and you leave it, the polymer takes some time to come back to its globular structure, right? So that is known as the relaxation time. And using that relaxation time, you can define what is known as a Deborah number, which has a biblical reference, which basically means that if you wait long enough, even the mountain would flow. So basically, if your observation time is very long, so if your Deborah number is very small, then your system is behaving like a viscous fluid. Whereas if your Deborah number goes to infinity, then it is going to behave like an elastic solid, which is very difficult to move. Okay, so now using this idea of the Maxwell pot model, so there is a model known as the Oldroyd B model. So probably proposed by somebody called Oldroyd, who had this A, B, C, D model. So the B model is known as the Oldroyd B model. So for polymers, so it is characterized by a solvent viscosity, which is in our case, it will be the viscosity of the water, and add to it the polymer viscosity. So depends on the polymer that you have added, and a relaxation time tau. And there are other assumptions in the model. Basically, it says that it's infinitely extensible spring. So the spring constant always remains same. It is not changing even if you stretch it. And then another thing is that there are no chain-chain interactions. So the two polymer chains don't interact with each other. And this can happen when the fluid is dilute. So the chains are far away from each other and then they don't interact. So now using these ideas, it is possible to write down the equation for velocity. So basically you have the pressure term, the isotropic pressure term, the anisotropic stresses, and the viscosity. Now this equation can be compared alternately for the Oldroyd B model of the polymers and the MHD model. So you can basically, the subscript P denotes the polymer, whereas the M denotes the MHD model. So basically you can write down the anisotropic stresses, sigma, which is defined for the polymer in this way, multiplied by the polymer viscosity. And you can add a diagonal term to it to make it, you add the diagonal term to it. So you'll know in a minute why have I done it. And then this sigma m is basically to subtract the diagonal term so that the trace is zero. So this sigma p has a trace which is zero, whereas sigma is a tensor in which the trace of the tensor is non-zero. And sigma m here is basically the Maxwell stress tensor, from which you have you have subtracted out the B squared term. So these concepts are all very well known by this nice paper by Ogilvy and Proctor, Michael Proctor in 2003, and also there's a nice paper by Dina Longkop in 2003, where they try to apply these ideas to the solar dynamo, interior solar dynamo. So the basic idea is that the long chain polymers interact with thermal fluctuations in the same way as magnetic field is interacting with the plasma turbulence. Now, if you like mathematics, so you don't have to like it right now. So I basically want to say that suppose you want to write an equation for the stresses for the polymer using the Aldroyd B approximation, and you also write the equation, basically the evolution equation for the Maxwell stress in MHD. So just focus on the fact that the left-hand side of both these equations look identical. And it's only the right-hand side which is different. So now if you take approximation in which this tau is tending to infinity, so the relaxation time tends to infinity. So this right-hand side of this equation would vanish. The Aldroyd B equation would vanish. Similarly, if you take eta approaching 0, even then the right-hand side of this constitutive equation for Maxwell stress would vanish. So this basically means that in the limit of very large relaxation time, polymer relaxation time, the Aldroyd B model behaves like, mathematically behaves like the MHD model in the limit of very low resistivity. Eta is the resistivity. So in the regime of high conductivity and high relaxation time, the Aldroyd B model is equivalent to the MHD model. So this has been experimentally as well as theoretically shown in a shearing geometry. So shearing geometry is like a quiet flow geometry where you have two concentric cylinders and you have a fluid and then you are shearing. Now our system is different. We have elongational stresses. So here basically there's a jet and the jet is being pushed up. So it's more like elongational than shearing. So in our work, we have shown that even in case of an uniaxial extensional flow, the concept is shown here. So you have a jet which you are essentially pulling up like this. And then you also have the stresses that you can derive. So this is an expression for the stress, the polymeric viscoelastic stress, let me call it, has an expression like this, where you have a term known as the Troton ratio. The Troton ratio basically tells you how the viscosity along the jet is varying with respect to the polymeric viscosity. So if you have a polymer which is being stretched in the vertical direction or any direction for that matter, the viscosity in that direction is increasing because those polymers are stretching and they are back reacting on the flow. So they're trying to get the jet down. So it becomes difficult to move or stretch the jet. So that is basically the idea of the Troton ratio. So for Newtonian fluids like water, the Troton ratio will just be 3. Whereas for polymeric jets, they can be as high as 10 raised to 4. Right? So then we compared it with MHD, the stresses in case of a 2D geometry that we have used. And then we find this equivalent. So you have these stresses on the left-hand side, you have the Maxwell stress, and that is equivalent to the viscoelastic stresses. So that is one of the scaling arguments that we have given in that paper. Now this theory is linear, so it can only go so far, but this system is non-linear. So what we do is we do parallel experiments. So here we took the solar plasma, the solar atmosphere, and then we applied a forcing just below the solar photosphere, a harmonic forcing again at 5 minutes with a 5-minute time period. And on the left, you see we have a polymeric fluid, which we are also applying a Faraday excitation, the same harmonic excitation, which is at a period of about 30 Hertz. And you see in both cases that you see this nonlinear focusing of quasi-periodic waves, because of which these fluids which were oscillating initially, they're breaking up into jets. Now for this solar atmosphere, we have used this setup using the pencil code. So we have used a radiative in local thermodynamic equilibrium, MHD simulation, where the equation of state is based on Shah ionization, and we have these further details here, and also anisotropic thermal conduction, and we have no flux emergence in our model, so which basically means that we start the model with an imposed vertical magnetic field, but we don't emerge any new flux. So that is basically our model. And now we want to do parallel experiments between these two systems. So we saw there was some amount of, mathematical similarity, but now we want to establish the phenomenological similarity. So we basically want to see that we see a forest of jets about, there are so many spicules on the sun at any point in time, millions of them. So do we also see a forest of jet in our laboratory, in that Petri dish? So for that, we first define a forest of jets. So basically that is defined here. So we need to have at least 4 jets in a particular observation time, which go beyond the critical height. So that is one condition. And the other condition is it should be a jet, it should be an elongated structure. So the aspect ratio width to height should be lower than half. So these are actually very, these are the conditions we have imposed. It is possible to change it, of course, but for the time being, we will look at the phenomenology from these, the point of view of these conditions. So inside, so we have again this solar atmosphere, where you see that you see these 3 panels. So these 3 panels are 3 different experiments carried out at the same frequency, F0, which is 5 minutes. But we could take any, we have, carried out the experiments at different frequencies. But here, all the 3 cases, we apply the harmonic driving at the same frequency, but the amplitudes are different. Yeah, so we have these 3 experiments, and so in one experiment, so there are these 3 different forcings, and then you see, can I rotate your screen? How do I stop somebody from stop sharing? Okay. Yeah, it's not working. Let me stop sharing and then share back again. Yeah, so basically now you see this, so you see this video in which you have these 3 cases. So the medium, the case in the middle is for the threshold driving. So this is the driving which produces jets which just about satisfies our condition. Whereas the one on the right, it does not cross the threshold. So we say there's no forest of jets. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see more jets than, than we defined in our forest of jet criteria. So that is above the threshold amplitude. So this way we basically get a threshold amplitude for the solar plasma case. Similarly, in the case of polyethylene oxide solutions, we did a series of experiments at a particular driving frequency. So each of these panels basically show an experiment, and only in 2 of these experiments we see that we cross the threshold, and we don't cross the threshold in the experiments shown in the leftmost panel. So on the rightmost panel here, we see that there are 2 experiments which cross that threshold, and we can define what is known as a forest of jets in the fluid. So now we take these, we perform a series of experiments at each frequency. We tune the amplitude, and we'll do several experiments, either numerical or laboratory. And then we can make this 2 plots here. So one is for the solar atmosphere, the other one is for the polymeric jets in the laboratory. And then you see this acceleration versus driving frequency. So we have now prepared a plot in phase space. So which is, so each data point here, whether open or closed triangles, denote an experiment. So these closed triangles are all above the threshold and can form a forest of jets. So if you take an acceleration which lies at this triangle at this particular frequency, you are bound to get a forest of jets. But if you're lower than that, you don't get a forest of jets. So also in the polymeric fluid. And then we also see a very similar trend in this phase space, in this acceleration, threshold acceleration versus driving frequency phase space. So that is an important phenomenological connection from the point of view of threshold acceleration. Now the next parallel, so the third condition, the first two conditions was basically fluid and gravity, and the third important condition for forming a forest of jets is large amplitude excitation. Now here, suppose you apply this large amplitude excitation for polymeric and non-polymeric solutions. So you do an experiment side by side. So here you see that the one on the left is basically polymeric solution, and we are exciting it using the same amplitude. It is about 5 times the Earth's gravity and at a frequency of 120 hertz. So you basically see that in one case, so here you can see the frequency and the acceleration amplitudes. In one case, you see a lot of droplet formation, and in one case, you don't see any droplet formation. Now, the good thing here is both these solutions have the same viscosity until you try to stretch them. So the glycerin is a Newtonian fluid. It does not, for the case of glycerin solution, so basically 55% glycerin in water. So that has the same viscosity as polyethylene oxide solution, 1,000 parts per million of polyethylene oxide solution. They have the same viscosity, yet you see a lot of droplet formation in the Newtonian fluid and no droplet forms in the polymeric fluid, right? So this gives us, this basically tells us that this viscoelasticity, the property of viscoelasticity, is preventing the pinching of jets. So parallelly, now we can do some more scaling argument calculation, and what we found is there's a threshold concentration of the polymer which is going to prevent or suppress the Plateau-Rayleigh instability in the polymeric fluid. Similarly, there's a threshold magnetic field in the plasma which is going to suppress the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. So we basically have these two parallel, the concentration in the polymer, which is equivalent in some way to the magnetic field in the MHD case. So here in the left side, you see we have imposed a vertical magnetic field of 74 Gauss, and then you can you basically see here that there are jets forming on the left hand side, whereas on the right hand side there are no jets. So there are these plumes, the Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities plumes, which are formed because of this shearing, Kelvin-Helmholtz shearing instability, and they just get turbulent and they just fill up the entire space. There are no jets when there are no magnetic field in the plasma, in the solar atmosphere, no imposed magnetic field in the solar atmosphere. We don't get any jets, right? So we basically quantify this a little bit more. So here we show you the panel where the magnetic field is 0 versus a case in the solar atmosphere where we impose very small magnetic field of just 1 Gauss. So even imposing a very small magnetic field of 1 Gauss gives, is going to suppress these really turbulent plumes. And similarly, in the polymeric solution, when we have no polymers, basically water, you see so many droplets here. And compare this with a case where you only have 100 parts per million of this polymer, high molecular weight polymer added. So here you see coherent jets. So basically we quantify these two things in terms of plot. So one for the solar MHD and the one for the polymeric case. So we try to measure the anisotropy introduced by the magnetic field. So basically, we have the anisotropy as a function of increasing magnetic field, and you see this kind of a behavior decreasing, continuously decreasing behavior as we increase the magnetic field. So the anisotropy increases basically as you, the anisotropy measure basically increases as you increase the magnetic field. Similarly, in the polymeric case, we measure the, or we count the droplets, or we measure the turbulence, and we also find that as you increase the concentration of the polymer, this turbulence is going to be suppressed. So there are these very similar plots of the case of solar and polymeric. So this basically tells you that the fourth ingredient is anisotropy, that is going to be very important in the to the concept of forest of jets. So basically we have this very close phenomenological analogy between the two systems. So you need just 4 ingredients. So you need the fluid medium, you need a gravity, and you need large amplitude quasi-periodic excitation and anisotropy. So once you have these 4 ingredients in your model, that, but not just a model, it could be your experiment, laboratory experiment as well, you are bound to have a forest of jets. So these jets need not be special jets, these are just really general jets, but these 4 conditions are sufficient. So I don't say they are necessary, but they are sufficient. And these forest of jets are formed by what is known as nonlinear wave focusing and suppression of instabilities, right? So I basically I said that you need a forest of, so I said that we have this large amplitude quasi-periodic waves, whereas, you know, I was showing all these plots where we are only exciting with harmonic, you know, cos or sine functions. So here I show an example where we have this experiment in the laboratory where we use sonified solar P modes. So we take the solar P modes from the MDI data and we convert it into acoustic frequencies. So the frequencies here in the MDI data would be, they are, the peak is at 3.3 millihertz, whereas we shift the peak to around 30 millihertz. But it is, we just do a Fourier shift here. And then you see that in this case, even you find a forest of jets for a polymeric fluid. So that's why quasi-periodic forcing is sufficient. You don't have to be exactly harmonic. But if you apply white noise here, you won't get any jets. So it has to have some sort of periodicity. Now we want to know if we can build what is basically happening in the real sun. So there are these 4 ingredients, but what is happening in the real sun? What is the forcing in the real sun? So here here on the left-hand side, I show a data from IRIS observations at the wavelength of corresponding to emission by silicon 4. So here the spatial resolution is about 120 kilometers, and then the plot in the middle is basically showing 80,000 Kelvin emission from a forward model from our simulations. And the last panel here, the lowest panel, is basically the EUV 17.1 nanometer emission, which corresponds to plasma at about million Kelvin. So emission from our simulations. So here you can see that you see these spicules which are forming beyond, and they are able to reach more than 20 megameters height. And on the right panels here, I basically show the parabolic paths followed by the tips of these spicules, showing that they have this ballistic nature. Additionally, some of these spicules, they show these bright tips seen in IIA 17.1 angstrom. So most longer spicules in our simulation show bright tips due to enhanced emission there. And at the base, sometimes we observe magnetic reconnection. And note that the model grid size is 16 kilometers in our model. Now we learn something else by introducing quasar particles in different layers. So what we learn from here is the plasma, which is at the photosphere, that's quite heavy, and these kicks are not able to push them into coronal heights. So most of the spicular plasma are actually coming from chromospheric height. So you see this blue color and upwards, this plasma can become part of spicule, but not the plasma which is yellow or black in color. So that never goes up. So that is one observation here. And then we further notice that we once we have these Lagrangian particles, we can color them with any physical quantity that we can calculate from our model. So for example, on the left-hand side, we color them with acceleration. So the green color always means the acceleration is positive here on the left-hand side, and so is the vertical velocity. So green color means positive velocity or acceleration, and yellow is negative acceleration or velocity, vertical acceleration or velocity. And here you see this sharp green fronts, which we call acceleration fronts, and they coincide, they correlate, spatially correlate very well with compression, regions of compression. So this might as well be shock fronts, and they are these shock fronts which are basically as they travel. So here I show a birth of a spicule. So this is a shock front or an acceleration front, which is basically traveling upward. So these arrows show the tip of that acceleration front, and the top one is again showing vertical acceleration. So as this acceleration front is propagating upward at the slow MHD propagation speeds, it keeps on energizing the plasma in the region through which it is passing. So in the lower panel, you see that the tip is gradually becoming greener and greener. So which means the vertical velocity of the Lagrangian particles, the quark particles, they are increasing as the acceleration front is passing through. The acceleration front after a while just passes into the corona, but it leaves behind a spicule. So this spicule basically does not rise and fall in unison. So inside the spicule, there is some microstructure. So part of the spicule, the tip of the spicule is still going up, whereas the plasma in the body of the spicule has started falling down. So now, so here, so basically in our model, now we see spicules which have a distribution of heights, lower as well as higher heights, larger heights. And we find that there are two different mechanisms which arise from the solar convection that can give rise to this process, these long and short spicules. So the shorter spicules are the one which is formed by mechanism known as granular collapse and squeezing. So that's basically like a garden hose pipe. So if you squeeze a garden hose pipe, then you have a jet which squirts up. So it is that kind of phenomena. And these produce shorter spicules as compared to the one where you have a granule like this. So you have a granule, and the granule is bobbing up and down at a frequency, at the prominent frequency of solar convection. And as the granule moves up and down, so you have that this granule kicks the plasma up. Now this is the case where the spicules formed are most energetic. And you will also find that above the granules, we also see magnetic reconnection happening at a height of, between 1 to 2 megameters. You see this reconnection happening that aids the plasma to, escape from the field lines and go up and rise up. So basically here again, it's a movie of the phase plot of the velocity versus acceleration of those Lagrangian particles. So it's a phase space plot. And this is the case where you have this garden hose mechanism, the granular lane collapse, where the kick is actually gentle, so the spicules are shorter. Whereas on the right-hand side, the spicule is being kicked by the granulation, and the kick is rather brutal. So basically, it forms this sawtooth kind of structure in phase space. So that basically means that the spicules would be longer. So large amplitude periodic peaks are propagating as acceleration fronts. So now these are the results from the convection simulation. So basically what we did was we did some tests, numerical and experimental tests, by applying some artificial driving in case of the sun. And and then compared it with what we could do in the laboratory by Faraday excitation. Comparing those two numerical and laboratory experiments, we found out 4 different conditions needed to excite this forest of jets in astrophysical system as well as in the laboratory. Now we want to know if those 4 ingredients are enough for the real sun. Can convection basically produce that kind of forcing that is needed to form the spicules? So what we find is, yeah, the result is affirmative. So the solar convection by itself can generate all kinds of spicules with a given distribution, long and short. And this is contrary to the current wisdom in the community. And spicules are made up of chromospheric plasma. So the plasma from the photosphere does not seem to become a spicule. So because the chromospheric plasma is lighter, so they can be accelerated faster, or they could have larger acceleration with the same forcing. Now, all of the plasma inside the spicule are not moving together. So there is a microstructure. And these spicules are then energized by what we call acceleration fronts, which are again forming because of nonlinear wave steepening. So these P modes, leaking P modes from the solar convection, they become steeper and steeper because they're propagating in a region of region of strong stratification. So now once we validate this model with solar convection, so this has now been extended to 3D by Shohel, and we can use this also to study the mass contribution to the solar wind. So that is one of the important reasons why we study spicules, because it is believed that they have a major contribution to mass and momentum of the solar wind, as well as contribute to the non-thermal heating of the solar corona. So I would invite you to go through a recent paper, and a lot more material than what I could explain here could be found there and also in our website. So thank you for joining us for this talk.
Okay, so thanks Piyali for a very interesting and very clear talk. So I would now urge people who have questions to just raise their hand, unmute themselves. Yeah, first question by Tushar Mundu. Yeah.
Hi, Piyali. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So very nice talk actually. And my question is related to that anisotropic nature, and what is the physical reason that anisotropy is decreasing with increasing that magnetic field strength, and what type of boundary condition you use when anisotropy effect is important?
Oh, so this anisotropy is not important in this case, from the point of view of boundary condition actually. So the mechanism is basically see the plasma. It's an MHD simulation. So the fluid and the magnetic field have to move together first of all because of the Alfvén flux freezing. But in the corona, since
Right.
you have very low plasma beta, so there are these Maxwell stresses which are countering the tendency of these plumes to form additional vortices. So this calculation that I showed you earlier, where we derive this threshold V for the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. So we actually derive it in the supplementary information of this paper, where we find out under what condition the vortex formation can be suppressed by this shearing instability. By doing that, we basically get this threshold.
So the boundary condition is not required. You mean?
Okay, you mean which boundary, top or sides or any boundary, or what is?
I mean, when anisotropy is important, then like you can't take like periodic type boundary condition. You have to take something else. So
yeah. So
in that, yeah.
So in the bottom, the boundary in the Z direction is not periodic. However, the boundaries, horizontal boundaries are periodic, but it is also possible to take a perfect conductor boundary. But we have not done that. We have used a periodic in the horizontal, and the bottom and the top are non-periodic. Of course, because there is gravity in the
Right. So top is like no magnetic flux.
no, there is no magnetic flux which is coming in from the bottom. and the top it is open, so we allow the outflow. It is an outflow boundary.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Got it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Axel?
Thanks, Piyali. Very interesting talk indeed. You made the interesting comment, and it looks from your animations also like this, that the spicule formation is already the beginning of the solar wind formation. So I have two questions. First, do you then think that the solar corona is actually not really critical for having a wind in the sun? And secondly, do the speeds, the average speeds that you see in your simulation actually agree roughly with what you would expect at the very bottom of the solar wind at that height?
Okay. So let me show this. Okay, so your first question is related to, is the corona not important for the solar wind? No, we don't claim that. What we are basically saying is there are these flows, and not this one. It was this, it was this one here. Okay, so we don't say that, but we have tried to measure the amount of mass flux. So see, the domain, the top part of the domain is only going till say 35 megameters, right? So at 35 megameters, we do see a net flux which is going up, the mass flux which is going up. But then what we have done in the top boundary, we have put a sponge layer boundary condition because we didn't want the waves to come back in. So only when we take a more extended or a spherical, we are able to do this in a spherical open kind of boundary. We can probably comment more on the solar wind aspect, but the speeds that we see at 30 megameter, they are exceeding 50 kilometers per second. Now that is at a height of 30 megameters, which I would say is not the top of the domain, but the bottom of the sponge layer. So we don't do any, we don't analyze anything in the sponge layer because that is a numerically imposed criteria. So that was about the solar, the corona, the importance of the corona. So we have not gone very high up in the corona. So basically, we don't know how the solar wind is being accelerated by this. We cannot study it because it is a Cartesian domain, and we have not gone so high. And yes, we do see a mass which is like not all the mass which is going up is coming back. So there's a deficit, but we are yet to quantify it from.
Okay, thank you. Very